So I'm going to cover a broad range of topics today from the regulation perspective, from the ACNC perspective. And then we'll be able to have an opportunity to have a bit of Q&A, answer any questions that you may want to raise. Always happy to receive any feedback about resources or something that you think is needed or needs improvement in terms of our guidance and education function. And if there's any burning topics that I can't answer, I'm more than happy to take things on notice and get back to you with answers to those specific questions. So let's get started. Just in terms of what the ACNC does, I'm sure many of you are very well aware of the role of the ACNC. We have celebrated our 7th birthday, so it's hard to believe the years have just trickled away. That was in December of last year. So our role continues to be registering of charities. Even though our name continues to have not-for-profit in it, we are not allowed to register not-for-profit entities. They have to be charities and they have to meet the definition of the Charities Act. So there is that anomaly, I guess, in terms of our name and what we're able to do in terms of our regulation function. So when the ACNC was created, there was a vision from the government at the time that we would first regulate charities and then that would be expanded into other parts of the not-for-profit sector. Through circumstances, that has not happened, but we retain that name, even though I will only be talking about the regulation of charities, those entities which are eligible to be registered with us under the Charities Act. Obviously, we maintain a publicly available register, which many of you would be aware. Hopefully, when you use the register now, it's a little bit faster, a little bit more friendly. So we had a systems overhaul in 2018. So hopefully you're seeing some of the benefits of that now. There's still a bit more work to be done, but it's vastly improved compared to what it was. In terms of part of our regulation role, reporting, the collection of information from charities is very, very important to be available to the public to help maintain and enhance public trust and confidence, people's understanding of what charities do, who controls them, and their financial affairs. So that's essentially the reason that we collect the annual information statement and financial reports from those charities which are required to lodge them. And we use that information for recognised assessment activity, which is the technical term under our Act. But that's really where our compliance and enforcement function comes into play. So we do take action where charities are not swimming between the flags, which is an analogy that we like to use. I just mentioned our guidance and our education function. That is really important. That was sort of spelt out at the creation of the ACNC, that there is a need to make sure that we are turning our mind to providing information, guidance, education, tools, resources to help the sector understand what it has to comply with. That has continued to be a focus of the ACNC, and I certainly don't see that changing going forward. And the last bit, which sits very firmly within my responsibilities, is trying to create improvements to the regulatory landscape so that charities are not having to comply with and deal with unnecessary regulatory obligations. Now, that's a very subjective area. Some regulation is necessary, but what is unnecessary, and there's obvious things like the duplicated reporting that we currently have in play across some of the states and territories. So our focus continues to be to try and improve the landscape and the environment for charities so that they can focus on their core charitable purposes and not having to spend so much time on compliance. So these are just some statistics that really sort of relate to the financial year 2018-19. So these are just taken from our annual report, but I think it's important to give a bit of context to the size of the ACNC, the entities that we regulate and from our perspective, what we are responsible for delivering on behalf of government. So last financial year, we registered over 2,500 organisations. Around 78% of applications that we receive are approved. In terms of the filing of returns, 70% of charities lodged on time. Now, it's very interesting when we compare ourselves internationally, we are seen as a bit of a leader in the reporting from charities. There are many, many jurisdictions that it's still paper-based. We are a digital by default agency, so around about 98, 99% of our interactions are online. So for government departments, particularly at the Commonwealth level, we are streams ahead compared to some other organisations that are grappling with how do we shift from paper onto a digital platform. And that's very, very evident, particularly with some of our international peers who are just starting to embark on IT transformation programs. So we're streets ahead, but when I look at that figure of 70% of annual information statements being lodged online on time, there's still room for improvement there. So there's still some work that we need to do to help the sector meet obligations in a timely manner. And that really goes back to trust and confidence within the sector, which is so very, very important. Now, if you're not aware, we do make a lot of information available on data.gov.au. That's a Commonwealth platform. The Commonwealth does have a focus on making data available that obviously can be shared. There are certain things the government has within their control that they probably don't want shared for obvious reasons. But data about charities is seen as very palatable in the public domain. And so we've got a range of data sets that we publish on data.gov.au, particularly useful for researchers, policy makers, think tanks and the like, because prior to the creation of the ACNC, there wasn't really that visibility at a national level of all of the organisations that were accessing some form of Commonwealth support, some form of exemption or concession, and effectively being supported by the taxpayer. So the charity register has come a long way. That is the interest or the views and the searches continue to increase year on year. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but our current commissioner, Gary, is very keen on seeing that increase. He wants information about charities to be available, he wants it to be used, and he wants it to be understood, and he wants it to be relevant. So I'll touch on that a little bit later. In terms of our compliance function, we did revoke 12 organisations, so roughly one a month, and that's been fairly consistent throughout the life of the ACNC. I think it's very clear, though, that at the creation of the ACNC, Susan Pascoe, David Locke, Murray Baird had a very, very clear focus on bringing charities on board, making sure that charities understood what their obligations were, and there was a very, very a softly approach to elements of regulation. And that was right for the time. The ACNC was contested. There was some, I guess, uncertainty as to whether the ACNC would remain. So that was the right sort of approach at the time. Things have moved on. We have tripartite support now from all of the major political parties. So we expect that our role obviously has to evolve. And the current commissioner is very, very clear that he is not a friend of the sector, he is not a foe. He is here to administer the ACNC Act and to help charities understand what they need to do, but we need to evolve in our regulatory approach. And we need to be taking action where action needs to be taken so that trust and confidence in the sector can be maintained. So currently, we've got around, well, this morning I checked, it was 57,666 entities. So when the ACNC started, there was well over 60,000. It dropped down to under 50,000. We're now back up to closer to 58,000 at the moment. Now, in terms of context setting, I like this slide as well. This is a slide that I've borrowed from my colleagues at the Australian Taxation Office. So this sort of outlines the not-for-profit sector in Australia. It's very unclear the exact size of the not-for-profit sector within the country, because there are many organisations playing in the not-for-profit space that don't have any registration or reporting or compliance obligations. So there is not an exact number known of the number of organisations which are outside of the regulatory regime. But you'll see there on the left, that circular sort of diagram, estimates have been made that there's around about 600,000 entities in Australia that identify as not-for-profit entities. Around 200,000 of those are registered with either the tax office, the ACNC, both, or they're known about. And the breakdown of those is around 56,000 for the ACNC. This was developed in May of last year, so that number has increased, as I said, to closer to 58,000 now. There is 137 entities, 7,000 entities which identify as tax exempt, and that's the self-assessment. And then there's a group of 8,000 organisations which are not for profits, but of which are taxable. And then the bottom line is some subsets of that information. So there's around about, it's probably changed slightly, but there's around about 27,000 entities that have deductible gift recipient status. And I will talk about that a little bit more as we proceed. But I think that's important just to sort of set the context for the not-for-profit sector in Australia. Now, when the ACNC Act was passed, it mandated a legislative review. Now, that legislative review had to occur at a period after the Act had been in operation for 5 years. So that review kicked off in December of 2017. It was delivered to the Minister at the end of May 18. Now, 22nd of August in 2018 was a day that some of you will remember in Australian politics. That was the day that we had a change of Prime Minister. So Malcolm Turnbull became the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison became the Prime Minister. That was the day that the report was tabled into Parliament. So there was a few things going on that day, so it was tabled without comment. So it was tabled in the Senate, and so we still don't know what the government response will be. Now, obviously we've had an election, so that happened last year. The Minister has assured us that he wants to take his time in considering the recommendations, and so he has said that we can expect a response the first half of this year. So I can't speak for government. I'm a public servant, so I need to be very clear. I do not speak on behalf of the government. I speak on behalf of the ACNC. So it's a government matter as to when they decide to respond to the recommendations with their views on whether they agree, disagree, and whether they want to take any action with those things. That being said, I think the exercise of having the legislative review was very, very worthwhile, and that will continue to be a very, very important source of information for the sector as a whole. Did you have a question?
Is that review or the recommendations?
It is. So I've actually, if I haven't included a link at the end of the slides, I will make sure that that is circulated, but it is available on the Treasury website. If you do a search on that name, Strengthening for Purpose, you'll get a direct hit on the report, which outlines all of the 30 recommendations and a raft of other things that were sort of compiled at the end as well. So that is publicly available. We just have to wait for the response from government as to what they're going to do with those recommendations. As I said, it was a very worthwhile exercise. We will continue to work with other arms of government both at the Commonwealth and state and territory level, to try to remove unnecessary regulatory burden and obviously to share information as we can, and improve the position that charities have in terms of the public broadly having trust and confidence in what you and your organisations do. Now, some of those recommendations, I might just touch on a couple of them because I think there are some that were quite topical when the report was released. One of them was the reporting thresholds. So at the moment we have 3 tiers: small charities revenue of up to 250,000 a year. Then we've got the medium in the middle, up to 1 million, and from 1 million above, large charities. So there was a suggestion made by the expert independent panel that those thresholds be increased quite dramatically. So the suggestion was made that the small threshold be lifted up to meet the current large threshold. So that would mean small charities would have revenue of up to 1 million, medium charities would have revenue up to 5, and then large would be above that. Again, I don't know what the government view of this is, but there would obviously be some pretty major changes there in terms of the reporting obligations, potentially the assurance requirements, the reviews, audits, and so on. Related party transactions. This is very topical. It is currently, we don't have full visibility of related party transactions across all charities, depending on the type of financial report that a charity prepares. So if it deems itself to not be a reporting entity, special purpose reporting does not mandate related party disclosures. So some financial reports we see, some we don't, but related party disclosures are very important for the ACNC to help identify whether there is any private benefit happening. And private benefit, as many of you would know, means that that affects the eligibility of being a charity. There should be very limited private benefit. Charities should be for the public benefit. So it is a very relevant consideration that we look at when we're undertaking any investigations or enforcement activity. One of the other things that was considered was the current exemptions that apply to basic religious charities. So basic religious charities don't have to meet the governance standards, and they don't have to meet all of the reporting requirements that applies to the vast bulk of organisations. So there was a lot of discussion about whether that's appropriate. Should that be changed? So the expert panel suggested that that could be reviewed, but only if a large number of other recommendations were adopted. So they didn't look at it in isolation. They took the view that if a whole range of other things were changed, then the government could have a look at whether that exemption should still apply. A couple of other things that were mentioned. I've already talked about our name and the fact that we are the Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. One of the recommendations was that larger not-for-profit entities should be subject to the reporting requirements and the obligations of registered charities, even though they aren't a registered charity. And one of the very significant things that we're still grappling with is the inconsistent regulations that apply across state and territory borders, as well as the Commonwealth in terms of fundraising. So very topical here in New South Wales off the back of the Bergen inquiry and the changes that we're going to see flowing through as a result of that inquiry. There was a whole raft of what were considered non-contentious recommendations made at the end. And again, they're basically tidying up of drafting errors or mismatches or inconsistencies between elements of the Corporations Act and the ACNC Act, for example. So we will see what happens with that when we know the government view. So that is something that I would strongly encourage you to have on your radar, because we are expecting that will be in the near future. But don't hold me for that, because I don't represent the government. Now, one of the big things, this is quite a big change for the current landscape for charities, especially those that are operating overseas, is the introduction of the external conduct standards. So are many of you from organisations or working with organisations that have got an international presence? So definitely some. So yeah, all right, great. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this. What I would sort of spell out though at the start is I won't cover all of the information or all of the detail that you need to know. What I would encourage you to do, if you think this applies to you, go and make yourself familiar with the information and resources that are available, because you want to make sure that your organisation is aware of some of these considerations and making sure that you're not putting your organisation at risk. Now, these are a new set of 4 standards. They outline how a charity should approach any work it's undertaking overseas, any funds it is sending overseas, any activities that it undertakes overseas, anything that is basically leaving Australia in terms of resources, be that cash, be that goods and the like, making sure that those resources are getting to the legitimate charitable purpose that is overseas. Now, I'm not a lawyer either, so I'm saying a lot of I'm not this, but reasonable steps are what the standards require. Now, what is reasonable, we could probably have a healthy debate about for a significant period of time. So the standards are deliberately drafted to place the onus on the charity to take reasonable steps. Now, what is reasonable will vary. So the intent of this is to help to promote transparency of any resources which are going overseas, which are intended for a charitable purpose, and to provide an element of comfort that those resources are being used for the purposes for which they should be used. Now, one of the other things that was sort of very important about these standards is the protection of vulnerable people. So obviously in the Australian context, we've had a number of royal commissions, which we're still seeing play out, that deal with people who are not able to defend themselves or people who are vulnerable to exploitation. So the standards also introduce an element of thinking about the protection of vulnerable people. And I guess from a really, really pragmatic view, the Australian government does not want to be supporting terrorism financing. So organisations which are sending money overseas, we've got international obligations around those things. We don't want to be seen to be aiding and abetting activities which are, you know, on a global stage, which are very, very problematic for governments to deal with. Now, when will they apply? So where a charity is either operating outside of Australia or a charity is working with a third party which is operating outside of Australia, there is a requirement to consider the external conduct standards. Now, there are some charities who only operate outside of Australia. There are some charities who operate in Australia and outside of Australia. So depending on the mix and depending on the particular circumstances, there may be relevance or there may not be relevance to the external conduct standards. But even if you only operate overseas in a small way, you may well be caught by these external conduct standards. Now, that last dot point, BRCs or basic religious charities, it's really important that I mentioned earlier there was an exemption to governance standards for basic religious charities. Basic religious charities are not exempt from the external conduct standards. So we now have a divergence where basic religious charities are being caught by these standards if they are undertaking activities overseas. So I think that's a very important point that really, really needs to be made. Now, what does operating outside Australia mean? So very, very simple case is sending money overseas, carrying out activities overseas. So there'll be some really obvious examples of this, perhaps on the global stage in terms of humanitarian responses, for example. There are some sort of listing there of some very, very straightforward examples of activities and things that charities do that would be considered operating overseas for the purposes of the external conduct standards. So if, for example, what a lot of churches do is they might collect funds in Australia, they might then send those funds overseas, and those funds might be used by a missionary overseas to help distribute Bibles to people that want to learn about the information that's within the Bible that supports their religion. That is an example where the external conduct standards will apply. In terms of an organisation that might be a registered charity in Australia that undertakes a program of online learning, and that learning is accessed by people who are overseas, that would be caught by the external conduct standards. So there's an element of thinking about where the benefit is derived with these standards. So they're quite complex. There is a lot of information that's available. So as I said, I would strongly encourage you, if you think this applies, go and have a look at the information that's available and make yourself familiar with what you might need to be turning your mind to. Now, like any good piece of legislation, there is an exception. So the standards do not apply where the activities or the funding or the resources are used in direct pursuit of the charity's purpose and they're merely incidental. Incidental in this context means something very minor to what the charity is doing and very minor in terms of the benefit outside of Australia. So if a charity does something that is incidental to a purpose that is undertaken here in Australia, then it might be incidental and these standards may not apply. The governance standards will apply unless the organisation is a basic religious charity. So an example of this is a school. A school might have a program of teaching French to its students. Those students might then go to a Pacific island that speaks French to help consolidate their learning. They might do that for a week. Now, even though those school students are from Australia, that would be considered incidental. So they're learning a language, they're then going overseas for a short period of time to consolidate and implement their learning. That would be considered incidental. Another example could be if a charity was to send staff overseas for a conference or for some training to make sure that they're aware of the latest developments, then that would be incidental because the benefit is being brought back with those staff into Australia, which will benefit the Australian context and will help the beneficiaries or whatever it is that the charity is doing here. Now, a third party is not a registered charity. So there are many charities that will work overseas with another charity. Now, why is that charity not a third party? Because that charity will have to meet the external conduct standards in their own right. But if a charity is working with a third party that is not a registered charity, the onus is on the registered charity to make sure that whatever that third party is doing in conjunction with the charity or for the charity needs to make sure that they are complying with the standards. So they need to make sure that reasonable steps have been taken across all of those standards to ensure that that third party is not posing the charity a risk. Hopefully that makes sense. I guess the importance of this really highlights, and some charities have been very clear about this, that they will prefer to work with registered charities in the overseas context because each charity is required to satisfy that it is meeting the external conduct standards in its own right. Whereas if they are working with a third party, there is a whole lot of, I guess, due diligence that needs to be undertaken to make sure that there are systems in place, there are procedures in place, processes in place, internal controls are in place, checks are in place, vetting is in place, because the charity will be responsible for actions which are being undertaken on its behalf by that third party. Now, the important aspect is, what are the external conduct standards? So the first one is really around the activities and the control of resources. So a charity must take reasonable steps to ensure that anything that goes outside of Australia is used for the charitable purpose, and it will maintain the character for which the charity has been created for. So charitable purpose, why is the charity doing what it is doing, and making sure that those resources are furthering that purpose. Making sure that there is no issues or contravention of significant pieces of legislation. And we're talking here about really serious stuff like terrorism financing, money laundering, exploitation, those sorts of things. The second standard is around record keeping. Now, this is an extension of what is currently in place. So charities are required to keep adequate records, operational and financial records, so that a story can be obtained or can be told about what the charity has done and how it has expended its resources. And obviously, for most of your organisations, you have a requirement to prepare financial reports. Auditors want to see some of those reports and some of that source documentation. So it's important that adequate record keeping is maintained. And that's really an element of good governance. So there's nothing untoward there. Charities should be doing this as a matter of course. The third standard is a really interesting one, because that talks about taking reasonable steps to minimise fraud and corruption. Now, some charities work in jurisdictions overseas where you won't get anything done unless you participate in some sort of bribe. So it's not about elimination, but it's about being aware of it and minimising it wherever possible. It's also about turning your mind to conflicts of interest. Now, in a lot of charities, and we've seen some of these play out in the public domain, some charities really, really grapple with and find some of these things very hard. It's all about disclosure and the way something is managed. There is nothing wrong with a conflict of interest as long as everyone knows about that conflict and whoever is in conflict is not making the decisions. Transparency, disclosure, sharing potential conflicts, they are all positive ways to manage this very, very complex area of operations that many, many charities have to deal with. Now, the fourth one is really around protection of vulnerable individuals. This could be beneficiaries of the charity, This could be staff of the charity. It could be volunteers. So it's quite broad. And you'll see that the word vulnerable is used very deliberately, and that is because it is not focused on children, but it is focused on anyone who is vulnerable. And in many overseas communities, trafficking, exploitation are all taking place. So there is an onus on a charity to make sure that reasonable steps are taken to minimise any wrongdoing to any vulnerable individuals. Now, what are reasonable steps? What is reasonable in the context of one situation will be very different to what's reasonable in another one. If a charity is sending money to New Zealand from Australia, I would say the risk is fairly low. Australia has a fairly secure banking system. New Zealand has a fairly secure banking system with high standards of compliance, high standards of safeguards, controls. That's going to be very, very different to sending money to perhaps some Asian countries or some African countries where the banking system might not be as secure. So the steps and the considerations will be very different, but will be very relevant to the context that you're actually dealing with, the circumstances that you're actually being confronted with. Now, some of you, like myself, have received, emails from people telling us that someone has passed away and we're, the heir to the throne, and they just need a little bit of money sent over to the bank account, and they'll organise everything, and we'll receive a ridiculously large amount of money. So we need to think about those sorts of situations which exist. Sometimes things are not what they seem, and particularly for charities, and this has come up time and time again, where people will say, we're only a very small charity, we only send $1,000 once a year overseas. We don't really have to worry about these external conduct standards, do we? And the answer is yes, you do. So if you don't know where the money is going, if you don't have any comfort or confidence that the person whom these funds are directed to is actually accessing them, then that's a problem. Because someone else could be accessing the money, and it only takes a very small amount of money in certain circumstances to do a lot of damage. And if you think about some of the conflict areas that are currently at war overseas, a small amount of money could do a lot of damage, particularly Australian dollars could do a lot of damage. And that's why we need to turn our mind to some of these real life examples of things that can go wrong. Now, moving forward to DGR reform. So I mentioned earlier, deductible gift recipient status. That is something that is obviously granted to a number of organisations so that they can collect donations, and those who are donating can claim a tax deduction for that amount. Now, in December 2017, the then Minister O'Dwyer made an announcement that the government would be reforming the way it administered DGR status. Now, there were a raft of things that were announced. This is literally a copy of the media release that was made at that time. Now, obviously, that was the previous Parliament. The Parliament has been dealing with especially the aftermath of the Hayne Royal Commission. So there is a number of recommendations which are taking a lot of time and a lot of effort to work through the parliamentary system. And so this has not yet been legislated. The timing of this has shifted from what was originally announced. This was supposed to start in July 2019. It has been updated to start in July of 2020. Now, we're now at the end of February, so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But the government position is that this will be starting in July of this year. So what does this mean? when the announcement was made, it was noted that there is a lot of complexity. We currently have the 4 different registers as well as the specific listings. So the way an organisation applies to each of those different registers is different. The information that's needed is different. The timeframes that it takes to get assessed and an answer given is different. Some take a matter of weeks, some take years. So the government acknowledged that there is an element of complexity here, an element of inconsistency, which needs to be improved. So what will happen is the separate registers. So there's the Overseas Aid Register with Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. There's the Rocco Register, cultural organisations with Department of Communications and the Arts. There's the Harm Prevention Register, which is with, or was with Social Services. There's also the Environment Register, which is with the Department of Environment. They will be consolidated into the ACNC register, and all entities will need to be a registered charity and therefore complete the reporting to the ACNC. There's a catch here because some organisations are not eligible to be a registered charity. So there will be an ability for the tax commissioner to exempt an organisation. So the tax commissioner will have the ability to say, you don't need to be registered with the ACNC because you're not eligible under the Charities Act. There was also an announcement at that time around the external conduct standards, which I've just talked about. So that's done and dusted. That was something which was always slated, but which had never actually been implemented. So that's now done. Another part of this reform was confirming that there would be an eligibility assessment undertaken for organisations which have DGR status, but which are deemed to be in a high-risk position and not necessarily being eligible to be a registered charity. So we have many organisations which are charities, which over time, their charitable purpose might evolve, their activities might evolve, and then before we realise, we actually look at what the organisation is doing compared to what it said it was going to do at the start, and there has been a bit of mission drift. And we've seen, again, some of these things play out in the public domain recently. So the government wanted there to be an element of checking to make sure that entities which are registered charities and have DGR status, because that really is the way that the Commonwealth supports those organisations to allow them to fundraise, they wanted a bit more oversight of that. Now, that doesn't require legislative change. So I mentioned before that the government are implementing the Hayne Royal Commission recommendations. That's basically taken up the bulk of resources of legislative drafting. So these changes have not yet been legislated, but in order for us to check eligibility, we don't need any legislative change. The government has given the ACNC funds to do this, so we will start these reviews from July. So watch this space. If your organisation does have DGR status, we'll be making announcements about what we will be looking at and the program of work over the coming months. But just penciling that in, that those will start from 1 July of this year. Other elements of this announcement were making sure that there was transparency and disclosure of political donations. So this is really about making sure that the information which is given to the Electoral Commission is also available and noted for registered charities. One other thing, criminal activities of charity staff and charity board members. Now, this was very contentious. Treasury did some consultation some time ago now, and if you think about a really practical issue, if a charity has been created to help ex-offenders, then that charity will probably benefit from having an ex-offender as a member of staff or as a board member. So there's some really practical challenges here that were raised throughout that consultation As I said, we haven't yet seen the legislation, but this is something to sort of keep on your watch list as that evolves over time. Now, some other legislative reforms which are currently either happening or have actually happened, and I really sort of want to make you aware of them, relate to several different things, but these are sort of the things that really jump out at me that I think you need to be aware of. The Corporations Act was amended recently, and that now requires particular treatment and protections to whistleblowers. Now, part of those changes were that corporations, so anyone who is registered with ASIC, the Securities and Investments Commission, needs to create a policy around how to deal with whistleblowers and the protections that will be afforded to them, as well as making that policy available to staff. And there are certain things that need to be complied with there. Now, there has been an exemption carved out for small and medium ACNC registered charities. The exemption means that those organisations do not have to develop a policy, but they're still bound by the protections and the treatment of whistleblowers. So there is a small easing, if you like, of the regulation there. So those organisations won't have to create a policy, but they need to be aware of what they need to do if there is a whistleblower. So that's quite important. There's also the inquiry that was undertaken by the Senate into charity fundraising in the 21st century. So this was tabled last year, if I'm getting my years right, 2020, yes, I think it was last year. Now, effectively, this had two recommendations. One of those recommendations was that the government needed to respond to the ACNC legislative review. We've already talked about that. The second recommendation was that there needed to be a consistent national framework for the regulation of fundraising in Australia, and it suggested that the Commonwealth work with states, territories, as well as the not-for-profit sector to develop that framework. We haven't yet had a response to government from that inquiry, but because that was so tightly aligned to the ACNC legislative review, I think that they're going to deal with them probably at the same time, because those recommendations were very, very similar in both of those separate inquiries. Another thing that I want people to be aware of is the proposal, which is a bill before Parliament. It hasn't yet become law, but it's important that people know about this. Part of the Black Economy Task Force response, dealing with the cash economy and minimising, I guess, non-compliance and non-payment of tax and those sorts of things, the government have introduced a bill whereby there would be an economy-wide limit for cash transactions. So if you made or accepted an amount of cash, so a cash payment of $10,000 or more, you would be in breach of this new piece of legislation. So if you're using electronic payment platforms, that's fine. But this is designed to eliminate the brown paper bags that seem to be exchanged from time to time, and making sure that it captures both the making of a payment as well as the acceptance of one. So again, that's something that I really think people need to be aware of if that will impact your organisations or your, your affairs. Another couple of things I want to touch on is the director identification numbers. Now, this has been talked about, was introduced by government through the budget process a couple of years ago. And effectively what this will be is directors will need to have a unique identifier. They will need to satisfy, the way I think of it, it's a bit like opening a bank account. You've got to have your 100 points of identification. This is going to be a similar sort of regime whereby if you want to be a director of a company, you will need to have your director identification number. Now, the intent behind this is to stop phoenixing activity. People create companies, rack up a whole raft of debts, and then, oh, sorry, we're now insolvent, and all of the aftermath, and then it pops up again. So the intent behind this is to make sure that there's visibility of who is in charge of organisations and who is accountable for those organisations. This is part of a larger suite of reforms which are slowly working their way through government, and this is around modernising business registers. So at the moment there is a number of different registers. Some are administered by ASIC, some are administered by the tax office. Essentially what this is going to see is a combination of several registers into the ABR, the Australian Business Register, to try to simplify the way those registries operate and modernise them, as well as introducing the director identification numbers. So because there are interplays between the corporate sector and charities, because there are a large number of charities which are companies limited by guarantee or large proprietary companies, then it has flow-on effects to registered charities. It also has effects on other regimes as well. So how this is actually implemented is still being developed and worked out, and there'll be more information about this over time. But again, I want to put it on your radar because it's something that you and your organisations will need to start thinking about. One thing that's not on that slide is that the ACNC has just been subject to a performance audit by the Australian National Audit Office. So that is expected to be tabled in the next few months. So there may well be changes from our perspective as to how we regulate out of that performance audit. So that's something else that you probably don't need to keep on your radar, but we need to be aware of those recommendations and what we might need to do in response to that audit, which may in time affect our interaction with all of you and the information that we collect from charities. So again, I'm not preempting anything, but we need to actually wait and see when that audit report is tabled, what the audit officer actually suggesting that we need to think about. The audit was quite broad. It was about the effectiveness of our regulation of charities. Now, moving right along, I wanted to touch a little bit on the priorities of the Commissioner. So Gary has been very clear. He wanted to improve the website, which was continuing on from the system upgrade, which I referred to earlier. He wanted to change some of the information that was on the register. And the second dot point is really his key focus, and that is making information available to donors, particularly donors, and donors could be the public, it could be government. Government fund a large amount of the charity sector in Australia. So donors is broad, it's not limited to individuals. Anyone who is funding charities, he wants useful information to be available on the charity register. He wants high quality information to be available that is relevant, that is accessible and useful to the largest number of users. Now, the way we will implement this, I'll talk about a little bit further shortly, but effectively there will be changes upcoming in the annual information statement. One other thing that the Commissioner is very keen to explore is the second object. So we have 3 objects in our piece of legislation. The second one is supporting and sustaining a robust, innovative, independent and vibrant not-for-profit sector. So what does that mean? There was no reference to that in the explanatory memorandum when the Act of Parliament was passed. So he wants to spend a bit of time exploring what does that mean. So there'll be a little bit more work for that moving forward. Now, just touching on the high quality information that I referred to, we will be changing some of the questions specifically about activities, specifically about beneficiaries, specifically about locations in the current annual information statement. So we'll be replacing them with program questions. So what programs does your organisation undertake? How does it undertake those programs? Are you providing services or are you providing cash to other charities? Who are the beneficiaries of your programs and where are your programs offered? So this will be a change. Expect to hear a lot of communication from us over the next sort of 6-month period as this is implemented. And I guess one of the things that the Commissioner is very, very aware of is that at the moment, searching the register is limited to particular attributes. And one of those attributes is purpose. Now, purpose might mean a lot to all of you who are within the charity space, but for someone who is not familiar with what charities do, they're not sure if they have to look up an organisation that is advancing education, advancing religion. They might want to look up schools, non-government schools in their area. So the intent of this change is to provide a mechanism for people to get more information from the register, which is useful. So in terms of the annual information statement, just a bit of history there. 2020, obviously that's the year we're currently in. We'll be launching the 2020 annual information statement, and that will have the change from activities to programs. We are very, very mindful and cognizant of the fact that any change to what we ask for needs to be communicated. There needs to be guidance and there needs to be resources. So we are very, very aware of that. And I can assure you that there is a team of people back at the ACNC who are turning their minds to this now and thinking about what we can do and how we can communicate these changes. So I've already really talked about this. Obviously, we have got a streamlined reporting arrangement with New South Wales for incorporated associations. I'll talk about that shortly. The Victorian government have announced publicly that they want a streamlined reporting arrangement for charitable fundraisers in Victoria. I can assure you, I met with my colleague in New South Wales this morning. They are very keen to do the same thing. So I'll be very happy to share that news once we get across the line in due course with New South Wales. But it'll be great to implement that streamlined arrangement with Victoria this year. Now, the annual financial report. So some of you will be accountants, some of you will be assurance providers. Obviously, HLB Man Judd are an audit firm and they specialise in these sorts of things. So there's been, and there continues to be, a number of changes working through charity reporting, namely the changes to financial reporting, particularly accounting standards. So I won't go through these in detail, but they're just some of the changes which are currently either in place, will be in place for your current period, or potentially will be in place for your next reporting period. So that's just really an underlining of the need to be aware of these changes. Make sure you're engaging with your accountants, make sure you're engaging with your auditors about these changes. In terms of group reporters, do we have anyone here who reports as a group, the ACNC? Yep, so quite a few. So we have made some changes to the conditions which apply to organisations which report as a group. And essentially what that means is it's a number of different distinct charitable organisations which are registered with the ACNC, but they only provide one annual information statement to us and one financial report for the whole grouped entity. If the grouped entity is preparing a special purpose financial statement, we are requiring that the adoption of AASB 124 in terms of related party disclosures is complied with, at least at a reduced disclosure level. So that's something to be aware of. It is a condition of reporting as a group. So it's very important that that is complied with. And in terms of, I talked a little bit earlier about the timeliness of reporting and submissions. We are analysing those organisations which are not meeting their reporting due dates. So group reporting is a benefit to organisations. It is not an absolute entitlement. So we expect timely reporting to be undertaken by all entities, especially the organisations which are getting some sort of benefit from the ability to group report. So what we actually do in terms of the checking, if you like, or the verification of financial reports that we receive is we actually do some analysis. The team dive into some of those financial reports and make sure that all of the elements have been complied with. So essentially making sure that there isn't any omissions, there isn't anything missing, all of the documentation that is required to be lodged has been lodged. So this is just a summary of some of the main issues from the 2017 reporting review. So bearing in mind that this is always going to be sort of looking behind us, because charities have 6 months after the end of their reporting period to lodge their reporting. So the 2017 findings were, there continues to be a little bit of a few errors between the transposition of information from financial reports to the annual information statement information, which is keyed in as part of the form. Some of the things that we're not seeing are adequate disclosure of policies. How is your organisation valuing things? What are the policies that are being adopted in terms of preparation of those financial statements? One of the biggest things we see is there is no reference to the ACNC Act. So what is the framework that these financial statements are being prepared under? And for a registered charity, that should include compliance with the ACNC Act. One of the other things that is quite obvious, and most times, thankfully, this is very easily resolved, is statements are missing, or financial reports will be submitted which are drafts, or which haven't been signed, or which don't have the audit report included. So these are simple things which can be resolved, but nonetheless, they're very important to get right. There's a lot more information available at the links that are there on that slide. Fast forward to 2018. Again, we're not always getting those 4 different statements. We might be missing one of them or 2 of them. It's a particular issue for organisations which have previously been reporting under the transitional reporting arrangements. Now, the transitional reporting arrangements are the ability for the ACNC to accept reporting which has been prepared for another government regulator. Why is that important? Because when the ACNC was created, we were basically adding another layer of bureaucracy to your regulatory landscape. So the expectation was that because we were coming in as a new layer, we should be able to accept the reporting that you were already doing for your state or territory or Commonwealth regulator. So it's very important that charities consider how these are evolving. Obviously, if you're an incorporated association in New South Wales, you can take advantage of the streamlined reporting arrangement, but you need to be evolving your reporting to make sure that it's fully compliant with the ACNC requirements. And New South Wales have got quite high standards anyway, so it's not so much of an issue, but some of the other states and territories where the state standard is lower, there may not be a need for compliance with accounting standards. There may not be a need for an audit. Some of those things, where we have streamlined reporting arrangements and charities report to us, and we give that information back to another regulator, you need to be complying with the ACNC framework. So it's quite complicated. I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but I would encourage you to have a look at the information that's on our website, which is available about the transitional reporting arrangements, which I'll touch on shortly. Also, making sure the notes to financial statements are there. Making sure that responsible persons, board members, directors, are all signing the declaration as responsible persons that the financial statements are true and fair. The organisation is solvent. Critical things. Yeah.
I've been doing some searches on non-profits on the site, on an index that's going to be attached financials. They've got the auditor's sign off that hasn't been scanned onto the web page. So it might be either someone's not scanning the entire document or they've deliberately left it off, I don't know. But there's been a few where I've done a search.
Yep.
And the auditor sign-off page that's indexed on the front page of the
is not there.
is missing, and I saw it probably on about 3 large non-profits missing.
I'd be really interested in getting the names of those organisations from you, because normally it's just going to be.
I think it wasn't the charity error. I think it was ACNC not scanning the document correctly.
Okay, so we get the file that's uploaded, and that goes straight through to our register. So there's actually.
No one in this room.
No, I'm sure not. But as a general point, anything like that you might see, I would really encourage you to let us know, because if it's not flagged, we don't check the information for all 57,000 charities. We're just not resourced to. That's interesting. So that's quite high, and that's concerning. So I'd be really interested in finding out who they are so that we can contact them. And it goes to the point that we've had issues previously whereby information is scanned and uploaded. We don't have the ability to check the contents of files. If it's a picture or a PDF, we've had shopping lists which have been scanned and appear on the register. And when we contact the charity, they're mortified because someone has just attached the wrong file. So it can be very easy to make a mistake, which is very problematic, obviously, for the organisations. And it's also a problem for us as well. I do want to highlight this page that we've got, and I'm mindful of time, so I'll try and get through this quickly. We have created a page specifically about the changes that are affecting charities from an accounting and auditing standards perspective. So we've added links to each of the other standard setters, and we're updating that with relevant information. And that was based on feedback that we received. So hopefully that's useful. It's all there. I've already talked about the streamlined reporting arrangement we have with New South Wales for incorporated associations. We're working on a streamlined reporting arrangement for charitable fundraisers. Stay tuned for that. I do want to highlight, though, that the transitional reporting arrangements, this is hot off the press. Gary has exercised his discretion on Tuesday, actually. So the transitional reporting arrangements have been extended for a further 5 years to enable us to continue working toward getting a streamlined reporting arrangement for charities in those jurisdictions which are still outstanding. Some current issues. So obviously, there continues to be talk and appetite about impact measurement. What are the outcomes that organisations are achieving? Now, obviously, a couple of years ago, there was an exposure draft that was put out by the AASB that was talking about service performance reporting. Now, that has not progressed further because the feedback on that was that it was too prescriptive, too hard, shouldn't be mandatory, and the like. I think there are some organisations which are very interested in telling their story. So we are very encouraging of charities who want to tell the story in the way that is fit for purpose for them about what they are achieving and how they are getting outcomes or what impact they're making in terms of their charitable purpose, their activities, and the programs that they run. I think following the ACNC review and also the project which is currently underway by the AASB in terms of the not-for-profit reporting framework, I think we will start to see a little bit of movement in this space. So I think it's something else that you would want to keep on your radar as a potential change in the future. But we're not yet at a point where we can even have a discussion about it, because that project is sort of still in its infant stages, but I would encourage you to be aware that that project is being undertaken and it will affect organisations. I think it goes without saying that the funding of charities is evolving and changing rapidly. Obviously, the rollout of aged care reforms, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, changes to government grants, the way organisations are being funded. Philanthropy is evolving too. Philanthropists are wanting better outcome by charities for the amount that they're investing. So what does this all mean? Really, this all means that charities are expected to be more transparent than ever and accountable for the funds that they receive, and there's not necessarily the ability to just rely on blocks of money that previously may have been given out. So we're moving now more to a fee-for-service model. Charities need to understand and have expertise in cash flow. What does it cost the organisation to actually undertake particular services or particular functions? And some of these things are very, very complex. So these are all things which are working their way through, but which are very, very relevant and continue to be. Now, it goes without saying, and I've even had conversations here today already about this, the response to the bushfires and the natural disasters which have occurred over summer. These are things which are really relevant to many, many charities in terms of making sure that they are applying funds to their charitable purpose. And we've seen some things in the media about different collections which have been undertaken, and some of the problems that are now being addressed or being considered because amounts of money have been collected for a specific purpose, but which promises have been made which don't necessarily align to that charitable purpose. So it's a really, really interesting space to watch how this evolves. I think the important things I want to highlight are that we have given a blanket extension to charities which have been affected by the bushfires. Any organisation which is in a bushfire affected postcode that has been declared eligible for government assistance by the Commonwealth, we have automatically deferred the due date to the 28th of May for their 2019 annual information statement. There are many organisations who have got a massive influx of donations. That will trigger different reporting requirements, the preparation of financial statements, audits and the like. There is a mechanism that charities can apply to the ACNC to be treated as a different sized entity if those donations are one-off in nature. So I would suspect there will be a number of organisations which have been the beneficiaries of large donations as a result of natural disasters, which may want to think about that. Also, the National Bushfire Recovery Agency. So we've been feeding information in about charities which are listed on that site. That's the agency which has been created at the Commonwealth level to deal with the scale of the bushfires that have occurred and are still occurring in some parts of Australia. So I just want to make people aware of that. Changes happening to the charity portal. So obviously we've had some improvements already in terms of resubmitting forms. We did have a problem where if you wanted to resubmit a registration form or the annual information statement, you had to pre-populate things. Ludicrous. So we fixed that, thankfully. That is an improvement. What is currently being fixed is that we know that there is issues with printing the annual information statement once it's been submitted. That's a problem because obviously many people in the organisation want to be able to see what has been reported. So it's something that's being addressed. We're also adding an authorised person form as well. Moving on to resources. So we are continuing to make resources available. The governance toolkit has been developed specifically around 4 key areas: financial abuse, working with partners, safeguarding and cyber security. So what does a charity need to think about in terms of managing the risks in these 4 areas? The self-evaluation tool. This now includes specific information relevant to the external conduct standards, which I've already talked about. It's not mandatory. It is a document that organisations can complete. We encourage organisations to consider this. We encourage organisations to discuss this with their board. It helps to highlight where there might be deficiencies within an organisation's governance, things that they might need to think about to meet the relevant standards that need to be met. Now, this is specifically for small charities, but we do have a lot of resources available around helping small charities with some of their governance requirements, which they may need some assistance with. But they're relevant for any sized organisation if you may not have a template available or a resource available. The charities report. This is basically a summary of all of the activities and information that we have undertaken. We do that each calendar year in terms of our enforcement and our investigative approaches. So this is a summary of what we have done and things that charities need to think about in terms of compliance. And really, the biggest issue we see is non-compliance with the governance standards. That's really the biggest issue that we see. Now, our regulatory approach is standard. It hasn't changed. We want to provide education and advice at a first step. We will work with charities if there is a willingness to address deficiencies. If a charity says there's no issue to see here, we're not doing anything about this, then we will revoke, because the charity doesn't leave us any option but to do that. So it's a progressive, proportionate approach to dealing with compliance issues. Now, I guess in summary, this is really straightforward stuff. There's a lot of change happening, and that will continue. I don't see that changing, and that's for any parts of the sector. It's for corporates, not-for-profits, the public sector. The expectations of stakeholders are increasing, so I expect that will continue. What I do want to highlight is the importance of charities engaging with their professionals and engaging early. So we do see instances where if a charity had engaged their accountant or auditor early, the issue that has blown up would not be an issue. So I really encourage professionals to engage with other professionals and get that expertise if there is a need for that. Now, I've already mentioned there's a heap of resources here. I'm more than happy for these notes to be shared. And there's a whole heap of links there, which you can work your way through. They're mainly things that I have talked about. And yes, the legislative review report is in there. That's me. Done. Thank you.